A communist spy hiding in plain sight among Tokyo's Nazi elite sends a cable that even Stalin dares not ignore. For 100 days, Richard Sorge, war veteran, press card-carrying correspondent, codenamed Ramsey, lives as a German insider beside Ambassador Ott, while secretly running Moscow's eyes and ears with a team no counterintelligence has caught. On day 66, his message says, Japan won't attack the USSR this year, unlocking the fate of Siberian armies, and maybe the Eastern Front. Yet each coded report brings him closer to disaster. How did the most dangerous undercover agent in history balance trust and betrayal right up to the day the net closed? The answer begins with that first day of 100 days as Richard Sorge. On June 22, 1941, German troops crossed into Soviet territory, opening the largest land invasion in history. For Stalin, the nightmare was not just the Wehrmacht's advance, it was the possibility that Japan, Germany's ally, might strike from the east. If Tokyo decided to attack across Siberia, the Soviet Union would face a two-front war it could not survive. The question in Moscow was simple and urgent. Would Japan go north or south? Every day, the answer grew more critical. Siberian divisions, some of the Red Army's best, stood guard along the Manchurian border, unable to reinforce the defense of Moscow. Stalin's generals knew these troops might tip the balance in the west, but moving them too soon could leave the Far East exposed. The fate of the Soviet capital, and perhaps the outcome of the war, hung on Tokyo's next move. Inside Tokyo, Richard Sorge watched the tension play out from a front-row seat. He moved through embassy corridors and diplomatic parties as a trusted German journalist, yet his true loyalty lay with Moscow. Sorge listened for any sign that Japan's military was preparing for war with the Soviets. He tracked cabinet debates, military deployments, and the shifting moods of Japan's elite. Even a rumor could have consequences measured in thousands of lives. The stakes were personal for Sorge. His reports had to be precise, backed by evidence, and delivered through channels that could vanish at any moment. If he was wrong, Soviet forces might be caught off guard. If he was late, the chance to save Moscow would slip away. Each coded message sent to Moscow was a calculation, risking his life to answer a question that could decide the future of two continents. In these first days after Barbarossa, the lines between friend and enemy blurred. Sorge's survival depended on convincing the German ambassador, Eugen Ott, of his loyalty, while quietly gathering the secrets that Stalin needed most. The question of Japan's intent was more than a matter of strategy. It was a daily test of nerve, patience, and the art of living two lives at once. Eugen Ott kept his closest counsel with a man he called friend, Richard Sorge. In the embassy's corridors, Ott's trust ran deep. Sorge's Nazi party card, issued in 1934, opened every door that mattered. But it was his insight that Ott prized most. When Ott needed to understand a new Japanese cabinet shuffle or a cryptic policy memo, he turned to Sorge. Together, they pored over cables and drafted reports for Berlin. Sorge's advice shaped Ott's dispatches, and Ott's confidence gave Sorge a seat at the heart of German-Japanese diplomacy. A few blocks away, Hotsumi Ozaki moved through a different world. Ozaki, a respected journalist, sat at the table with Prime Minister Konoe's inner circle. His role as cabinet advisor was more than a title. He was a voice in the Breakfast Club, a select group shaping Japan's next moves. Ozaki tracked debates about oil, war, and the empire's future. He brought back details that rarely left the cabinet room: who hesitated, who pressed for action, and what the generals really feared. For Sorge, Ozaki's reports were the pulse of Japan's leadership. Holding the network together was Clausen. By day, he ran a small business selling blueprint machines, plausible, quiet, and unremarkable. By night, Clausen became the network's lifeline. He built and operated the radio set that linked Tokyo to Moscow, assembling it in minutes and breaking it down just as fast. Every message had to be short, coded, and sent in narrow windows to avoid Japanese radio patrols. Clausen's technical skill kept the line open, but it was his discipline, never transmitting a minute too long, that kept them all alive. Each channel brought its own risk, but together they gave Sorge reach no single agent could match. Ott's trust opened the German embassy. Ozaki's access revealed Japan's highest secrets. Clausen's radio carried it all to Moscow. For a few crucial months, this web held, connecting the fate of armies to a handful of conversations in Tokyo apartments and embassy offices. Inside a cramped Tokyo apartment, Max Clausen's routine ran with the precision of a metronome. Every few nights, he unpacked a radio set, built from ordinary parts, strung copper wire around the ceiling, and waited for the city's noise to die down. The transmission window was short, never more than 7 minutes. Any longer, and Japanese radio patrols might catch the spike in static. Clausen's hands moved quickly, tapping out coded bursts destined for Vladivostok. The signals were wrapped in a one-time pad, numbers pulled from a German statistics almanac, making the content unreadable even if intercepted. The risk was constant. Japanese counterintelligence had been hunting for unauthorized transmitters since before the war. Their direction-finding vans roamed the city, mapping echoes and triangulating signals, but Clausen's discipline kept them guessing. He changed locations, broke down the set after each session, and never sent more than a handful of lines at a time. The antenna, just two thin wires, hugged the walls, invisible to anyone outside. On the other end, Soviet operators in Vladivostok listened for Clausen's call sign, logging each message by hand. Sometimes atmospheric noise forced him to repeat transmissions, adding to the risk. But the system worked. Between July and August 1941, dozens of short, encrypted bursts slipped through the static, carrying updates on cabinet debates, military movements, and the shifting mood in Tokyo's embassies. The network's survival depended on this rhythm. Sorge and Ozaki gathered intelligence in the open, but Clausen's radio was the lifeline. Each message was a test of nerves. One mistake could bring the Kempitai to their door. As summer gave way to autumn, the patrols grew more aggressive. Reports of mysterious signals multiplied. Clausen's windows shrank, and the silence between transmissions stretched longer. Still, the line to Moscow held. For now, the ring stayed invisible, their coded numbers slipping past the hunters in the night. Day 46, August 25th, 1941. Inside the German embassy, Sorge reviewed the latest cables with Ott, scanning for any hint of a dramatic shift. The atmosphere in Tokyo had changed. Japanese planners, battered by the American oil embargo, had begun to weigh their options with new urgency. Oil stocks were shrinking fast, enough for maybe 2 years if rationed. The army still watched the Soviet border, but the real energy was moving south. Cabinet discussions circled around the Dutch East Indies, British Malaya, and the Philippines. Resource lists grew longer, and the sense of a ticking clock was everywhere. Ozaki, working late into the night, gathered whispers from the Prime Minister's advisors. Notes from the Showa Research Association hinted at a growing consensus. Japan would push south for oil and rubber, even if it meant war with the United States or Britain. The North, Siberia, was a contingency, not a plan. The Army's mobilization in Manchuria was still on paper, but the Navy's voice was louder now, pointing to the embargo and the need to act before reserves ran dry. In the cramped apartment where Max Clausen set up his radio, the window for transmission was tight. 7 minutes, no more. Clausen tapped out a coded summary. Japanese military preparations increasingly focused on the southern advance. Diplomatic channels still open, but with little hope for breakthrough. The message was wrapped in numbers, passed through the book cipher, and sent across the static to Vladivostok. The content was careful, the tone measured. No single cable could claim certainty, but the pattern was clear enough for Moscow to see the drift. Sorge's report didn't offer a guarantee. It reflected a landscape in motion, resource tables, military rail traffic, and the latest from Ozaki's circle. The embassy's own assessments, shaped by Sorge's hand, now leaned south as well. Ott's dispatches to Berlin echoed the same logic. Japan's best chance at survival lay in the islands and oil fields of the south, not in a frozen gamble against the Red Army. The consequences of these reports rippled outward. In Moscow, each line of code from Tokyo added confidence that the Siberian divisions could remain in place for now, or perhaps even move west if the pattern held. But the need for hard confirmation grew sharper. The network's access was strong as their logic sound, but the stakes demanded more than probability. For Sorge, the August signals raised confidence in his sources and in his own ability to read the city's pulse from within the German and Japanese elite. The question of Japan's intent was narrowing, but it was not yet closed. On September 6, 1941, Japan's highest leaders gathered in Tokyo for an Imperial Conference, the Gozen Kaigi, that would decide the nation's course with the world closing in. The meeting began at 10 in the morning and ran for 2 hours. Every seat was filled. The Prime Minister, the Foreign and War Ministers, the Navy and Army Chiefs, the Finance Minister, the Planning Board President, and the Emperor himself. No one in the room could ignore the pressure. American oil had stopped flowing in August, British and Dutch sanctions were biting, and Germany's war in Russia had turned the Pacific into a powder keg. The decision, stamped and recorded that day, laid out a 3-part policy. First, Japan would complete all war preparations against the United States, Britain, and the Netherlands by the end of October. Second, diplomatic negotiations with the U.S. would continue in parallel, with Japan offering its maximum concessions, already written in an attached document. Third, if, by early October, there was no real hope that Washington would accept Japan's terms, the government would immediately choose to go to war with America, Britain, and the Netherlands. The language was precise. The military would not wait for endless talks. War readiness had a deadline, and so did diplomacy. The attached guidelines made clear that Japan's core demands, recognition of its position in China, restoration of trade, and access to Southeast Asian resources, were not up for debate. Any American response that fell short would trigger the next phase. Behind the closed doors, the split between civilian and military leaders was sharp. Prime Minister Konoe and Foreign Minister Toyota pushed for more time, hoping that talks in Washington might yield a last-minute settlement. War Minister Tojo and the Army chiefs argued that delay would only drain Japan's strength. The compromise, war preparations by late October, diplomacy until early October, let both sides claim a piece of the policy, but the clock was set. Once the Emperor gave his silent nod, the machinery moved into high gear. Army units began shifting south from China and Manchuria. The Navy accelerated its plans for coordinated strikes across the Pacific. Intelligence and planning staffs worked through the night, drawing up schedules and supply lists to meet the looming deadline. The press release issued hours later listed every official in attendance, down to the color of their formal dress, but gave no hint of the gravity of what had just been decided. For those with access to the real minutes, the consequences were unmistakable. The conference locked Japan onto a path. If the United States refused to yield, war would begin within weeks. The Gozen Kaigi's three-part guideline, its early October diplomatic cutoff, and its late October war readiness order became the operational spine for every Japanese action that followed. For Richard Sorge's network, this was the proof Moscow needed, the clearest receipt yet that Japan's focus was shifting south, and that the Soviet Far East would remain quiet, at least for the rest of 1941. Day 66, September 14, 1941. In Tokyo, a coded message left Clausen's radio, bound for Moscow. The content was clear: Japan would not attack the Soviet Union that year. Sorge's analysis, drawn from cabinet debates, embassy whispers, and Ozaki's access to the Prime Minister's inner circle, carried unusual weight. The cable summarized weeks of evidence: military units shifting south, oil reserves running thin, and the government's new policy after the September 6th Imperial Conference. For Stalin, this was the answer he'd waited for. The Red Army's best divisions, 12, maybe as many as 18, could now be released from the Siberian border. Trains began rolling west, carrying men and machines from Vladivostok toward the defense of Moscow. The report landed in Moscow alongside other signals, diplomatic intercepts, border reconnaissance, and chatter from Berlin. Sorge's reputation for accuracy gave his words more power than most. The GRU noted his sources' proximity to decision-makers. The Politburo flagged the cable for Stalin's attention. The message didn't promise safety, but it bought time. Soviet planners knew the risk. If Sorge was wrong, the Far East would stand exposed. Still, the calculus changed. Troop trains passed through endless forests, their destinations marked only by numbers and orders. Inside the Tokyo network, the moment brought a rare sense of accomplishment. Sorge's assessment had been shaped by Ozaki's read on the cabinet and the embassy's own pessimism about any northern adventure. Clausen's radio window that night was just over 6 minutes, enough to send the message and break down the set before the patrols circled back. The city's static swallowed the signal, but in Moscow, the message was received, logged, and relayed up the chain. The cable's impact rippled far beyond the spy ring. The Wehrmacht's drive on Moscow would soon meet fresh Siberian troops, men hardened by winters the Germans could barely imagine. Sorge's words, encoded and relayed in the Tokyo night, helped shape the battle lines on the other side of a continent. For the network, it was a brief triumph, a moment when analysis, access, and nerve aligned. The hunters in Tokyo, though, were growing closer. For now, the line to Moscow held, and the city exhaled. By late September, the search for unauthorized radio signals in Tokyo was no longer a background hum. It was a growing obsession inside Japanese counterintelligence. In a windowless room at the Owata receiving station, operators logged bursts of coded static, each one lasting no more than 7 minutes. Every transmission was recorded by hand, the time and frequency inscribed in neat columns. Some nights, the signals vanished after only 4 minutes. On others, they stretched to the full 7, but never a second longer. The operators knew these patterns weren't random. Someone in the city was sending messages with a discipline that suggested military training and a fear of being found. Mobile direction-finding vans circled the neighborhoods of Setagaya and Shibuya, their antennas sweeping the skyline. The search radius tightened with each intercepted burst. By comparing echo arrival times from different atmospheric layers, technicians at Owata could estimate the distance to the source, narrowing the grid to a handful of city blocks. The vans worked in shifts, plotting the strongest signals and marking them on a growing map of the western suburbs. Patrol logs from September and October show the net drawing closer, the gaps shrinking week by week. The routine became relentless. A signal would flare, the vans would triangulate, then silence. Each time the source slipped away just out of reach. Inside a small apartment, Max Clausen kept his radio kit packed and ready to move. He set up only when the city's noise masked the static, always breaking down the set before the patrols could zero in. The pressure left little room for mistakes. Clausen's hands shook as he tuned the dials, his eyes fixed on the clock. 7 minutes was the rule. Any longer, and the risk doubled. The strain showed in his face and in the careful gaps between transmissions. Some nights he waited hours for the all-clear, sending only when the streets below were empty of strangers. The Kempei's reports began to reflect a new urgency. Unexplained transmissions now appeared on multiple nights, always from the same general area. The search radius, once measured in kilometers, was down to a few city blocks. The technical logs, frequency, duration, atmospheric conditions stacked up in evidence files. The net was tightening, and the men inside the ring could feel it. For Clausen, the sound of a van's engine outside the apartment was enough to freeze his breath. Each coded burst became a gamble, every session a test of nerve against the clock and the hunters on the street. By the first week of October, surveillance teams were working around the clock. The city's grid was mapped, the patrols constant. The watchers had learned the rhythm of the ring. Every intercepted signal brought them closer, not just to the source, but to the people behind it. The ring's lifeline was now a beacon for its pursuers, and the space for error was shrinking with each passing night. Day 96, October 14, 1941. In the early morning, Hotsumi Ozaki was taken into custody by the Tokubetsu Keisatsutai. The official record lists October 14th, but some accounts put the arrest a day later. Ozaki, a cabinet advisor and a trusted voice in Prime Minister Konoe's inner circle, was now cut off from the world he'd moved through so easily. Policy meetings, research circles, late-night debriefs with Sorge. The police files note the time, just after dawn on a quiet residential street. No warning, no chance to run. Ozaki's arrest wasn't just another name in a ledger. It was the first break in the network's chain, the moment the ring began to unravel from within. Japanese investigators had been closing in for weeks, mapping connections and watching for patterns. The arrest logs show a deliberate pace. No sudden raids, just steady pressure. Ozaki's capture followed the earlier detention of Yotoku Miyagi, whose failed escape attempt had already given the authorities a partial map of the ring. Now, with Ozaki in custody, the Kempei and Toko had what they needed to start pulling at every thread. Names, addresses, the rhythm of meetings, even hints at the radio's location. Inside the interrogation room, Ozaki faced trained officers who already suspected his ties to foreign agents. The transcripts record his silence at first, then guarded admissions about his political views. He tried to shield others, but the evidence was mounting. Notes from Showa Research Association meetings, fragments of coded language, the pattern of his visits to Sorge's apartment. Each answer tightened the trap around the rest of the group. For Sorge, the arrest landed like a warning shot. Ozaki's absence from their usual haunts was impossible to miss. The radio operator, Clausen, shortened his transmission windows even further, sometimes to less than 5 minutes. The network's routines, once almost invisible, were now under a microscope. Every contact, every coded note carried new risk. The official paperwork on Ozaki's arrest carries a date stamp, October 14, 1941. Some sources, including post-war testimony, list October 15th. The discrepancy remains in the record, a reminder that even the smallest details can be uncertain when the pressure is on. What's not in dispute is the effect. With Ozaki gone, the ring lost its link to the cabinet's inner circle. The information flow that had kept Moscow ahead of Tokyo's next move slowed to a trickle. Ozaki's wife, Chio, received the news from police at her door. The shock rippled through the small circle of family and friends who knew only his public face. A respected journalist, a government advisor. In the days that followed, other arrests would follow, each one tightening the net. But Ozaki's fall was the first domino, the moment the ring's invisibility began to fail. The network's fate was now sealed. The only question left was how quickly the rest would fall. Day 100, October 18, 1941. The morning began with the city already under watch. Kempeitai officers moved in silence, their orders precise, their route mapped days in advance. Sorge's apartment, once the hub of coded messages and whispered secrets, was now just another address on a police ledger. The arrest was quick. No warning, no struggle. Sorge was taken before he could reach for his notes. The officers found him with a German newspaper still open on the table, the last prop in a performance that had fooled diplomats and generals for years. Within hours, the network's lifeline was severed. Clausen's radio, the transmitter that had carried hundreds of coded bursts to Moscow, was dismantled and hauled away. The Kempeitai logged every part: the copper wire antenna, the battered briefcase, the German statistics almanac used for the cipher. The radio archive, years of intercepted, undeciphered static, was boxed and catalogued, the content still a mystery until Clausen's confession days later. The Owata receiving station's intercept logs, with their neat columns of time and frequency, were matched against the confiscated equipment. 7-minute transmissions, always just before dawn, now pointed to a single source. Sorge faced his interrogators alone. The embassy doors were closed to him. Ott, the ambassador who had trusted him with every secret, was kept at a distance, his disbelief matched only by his sense of betrayal. Masinger, the Gestapo liaison, reviewed the reports with a mixture of relief and embarrassment. He had missed the spy sitting across from him at every embassy dinner. In the first hours of custody, Sorge said little. The Kempeitai pressed him for names, for codes, for the location of the cipher pads. He offered none. The arrest report listed him as a German journalist, a communist, and an unrepentant enemy of the state. Outside, the city moved on. The embassy staff heard rumors before the official notice arrived. The German community, once charmed by Sorge's bravado, closed ranks. At Sugamo prison, Sorge was registered under his real name, the first time in years he had used it without a mask. The cell door closed with a finality that left no room for negotiation. The radio traffic that had kept Moscow informed of every cabinet debate, every shift in policy, fell silent. For the first time since 1933, there was no coded message waiting in Vladivostok. The Kempeitai's records show the operation as a clean break, a single day's work ending a 6-year hunt. But for Sorge, the collapse was total. His network was gone, his cover stripped away, and the only sound left was the echo of a cell door locking behind him. The war outside continued, but inside Sugamo, the story had reached its end. At Sugamo prison, Richard Sorge's world narrowed to concrete walls and the echo of footsteps in the corridor. His name entered the prison ledger on October 18, 1941. No longer a correspondent, no longer a trusted guest at embassy dinners, but prisoner 323. The cell door closed behind him and the city's noise faded. For 3 years, his life would be measured in interrogations, censored letters, and the slow passage of seasons behind bars. The Kempeitai pressed for confessions. Sorge faced questions about codes, contacts, and the cipher pads that had linked Tokyo to Moscow. He answered with fragments, sometimes deflecting, sometimes silent. The radio logs, stamped with dates, times, and frequencies, matched the equipment seized from Clausen's apartment. 7-minute bursts, always before dawn, lined up with the Owata receiving station's intercept records. The evidence was methodical, but the code remained unbroken until Clausen's confession. Hanako Ishii, Sorge's partner since 1936, became his only visitor. She brought food, books, and quiet companionship. Sorge's letters to her, preserved in the Sugamo files, reveal little about his trial or the charges he faced. Instead, he wrote about the weather, about missing the small routines of their life together, and about his hope that she would be spared any further scrutiny. Ishii's devotion outlasted the war. After his execution, she searched for his remains and tended his grave until her own death, decades later. Her loyalty was a quiet counterpoint to the silence from Moscow. The Soviet Union never intervened. Requests for prisoner exchange or diplomatic contact were met with denial. We in the Soviet Union know nothing about any such person as Richard Sorge. Sorge's name vanished from official records. Back in Moscow, his wife Katya Maximova was arrested and died in the Gulag in 1943, accused of being a German spy by association. The Soviet state, wary of any agent tainted by foreign contact, cut its ties and left Sorge to face his fate alone. On November 7, 1944, the anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution, Sorge and Hotsumi Ozaki were executed at Sugamo. The timing was not lost on those who remembered their cause. The prison records list their deaths within an hour of each other, Ozaki first, then Sorge. Their bodies were buried in unmarked graves, their stories sealed in classified files. 2 decades later, the Kremlin reversed its silence. In 1964, after Nikita Khrushchev watched a French film about Sorge, the Soviet Union posthumously awarded him the title Hero of the Soviet Union. The decree, signed that November, praised his exceptional courage and heroism. Monuments rose in Moscow and Baku. Sorge's name entered textbooks and official histories. His September 1941 report credited as a key factor in freeing Siberian divisions for the defense of Moscow. Yet historians continued to debate the legend. His intelligence mattered, shaping decisions at the highest level. But it was not the only voice in Stalin's war room. Signals, intercepts, border reports, and diplomatic channels all played their part. In Japan, Sorge's legacy became a subject of academic study and public fascination. The Sugamo files, the trial transcripts, and the radio logs remain as evidence. His story endures in the tension between loyalty and abandonment, between the silence of the cell and the posthumous honors that followed. The echoes of his life, coded messages, brief visits, the devotion of Hanako Ishii, outlasted the war, leaving questions about sacrifice, recognition, and the price of secrets that no regime could fully answer. On October 18, 1941, day 100, Richard Sorge was arrested in Tokyo by the Kempei Tai. Over the previous 3 months, Sorge and his network delivered critical intelligence, including the September 14th report confirming Japan would not attack the USSR that year. This assessment, backed by documents and radio intercepts, allowed Soviet leaders to redeploy divisions west, though it was one of several sources informing the decision. The record shows Sorge operated under constant risk, relying on trust from figures like Ambassador Ott and Ozaki, until Japanese counterintelligence closed in. Some questions remain. Not all of Sorge's cables have been declassified, and the full extent of his impact on Soviet strategy is still debated by historians. Sorge was executed on November 7, 1944, posthumously named a Hero of the Soviet Union in 1964. Today, his case stands as documented proof of how intelligence shaped the outcome of World War II, reminding us that even the most decisive reports emerge from uncertainty and risk.